Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in to the show, and thanks for supporting the station. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can send an email to comment@am950radio.com. So I'm going to start out with this week's show talking about the DFL primary for Senate between Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig. So the reason I'm doing this is I've been asked from a number of people, like, what do I think about it? What are some of my thoughts about it? They, ask me, well, who should I vote for in the primary? And for that last question, I always tell them, well, vote for whoever you want to vote for. I'm not trying to tell you who you should vote for. I'll tell you who I'm going to vote for, but that ultimately is up to you. So just a reminder that the primary, the election day for that is August 11th. Now there's early voting going on in the state, so you can do that. And I believe on Friday, this is a couple, a day or two before you're listening to the show on the radio. So on the 24th of July, I think that opens up early voting where you can actually put your ballot into the machine, which is when I normally go early vote. So I'll be doing that myself prior to August 11th. But make sure you get out and vote, for the primary. This is a big, election. There's lots of bad blood going on between these two, and there's like millions of dollars being spent on this race already, just in the primaries. So, make sure your voice is heard and make sure you vote in the primaries. So recently, Bernie Sanders was in town over at First Avenue campaigning for Flanagan. And, that from what I read about that, the place was full and there was even people, a line waiting outside to get in and they couldn't all get in. So, that rally was pretty good for Flanagan's campaign. And the reason that I'm wanting to talk about this a little bit is because I think this campaign, this primary election shows you kind of what's, the fight that's going on right now in the Democratic Party nationwide and here in Minnesota, the DFL party. Like on the one hand, you got, the centrists, the corporate Democrats trying to keep, the power that they mostly have in the party. And now you have more progressive candidates running around the country in this year's primaries, trying to get rid of some of these corporate Democrats. And in our case, this was an open Senate seat. So, Angie Craig represents the corporate Democrats, the centrist Democrats trying to get the seat. And Flanagan is representing the more progressive side of the party right now. So there's this, fight going on internally within the party about, who's going to get this seat. And you can see it along the lines in a lot of other primary elections across the country. So, here in Minnesota, if you're a Democrat, you definitely have a choice between Craig centrism and, where she votes for usually, small steps to be taken on policy issues, which is what most of the corporate or the centrist Democrats do. Whereas Flanagan is more, she's out there campaigning more about taking bolder, bigger steps on various policy issues. So, you also have a clear choice between if you're going to support somebody with the big corporate money like Craig has the advantage of, or if you're, going to be, if your money's going directly to small donors and that is where Flanagan has the edge. So, the rhetoric definitely has been, heating up over the last few weeks. If you, been reading some of the articles and listening to some of the interviews that both candidates have been doing. So some of the things that I'm going to be talking about here, some of these quotes come from the latest rally where Bernie Sanders showed up. So Craig was saying, when Bernie came to town, well, and was supporting Flanagan, we don't need another Bernie Sanders in Congress. So just a couple comments about that. First of all, the most popular Democrat is Barack Obama. The second most popular is, even though Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat, right? He's an independent, but he's the second most favorite Democrat, because that's the policies that he, talks about and votes for. So, the fact that, well, we don't need another Bernie Sanders in Congress. Well, he's a pretty popular guy. And, Flanagan's event was entitled "The Many Over the Money." Right. So this is basically taking a little bit of a shot at Craig's, corporate donors and the millions of dollars that she's getting in from various super PACs to fund her campaign, particularly in digital and TV ads. I mean, I'm seeing, when I'm on the internet, I see a lot of ads supporting her. And this primary could turn out to be one of the most, if not the most expensive primary in our state history by the time it's all said and done, because we still got a few more weeks left before the actual election day. So, I looked into Angie Craig's main corporate donors. So one of them is cryptocurrency, right? And I believe, if my memory is correct, but if not, someone can let me know. But I think she went to a meeting, a pro cryptocurrency meeting, and she might have been like the only Democrat there, or just, a handful of them there. So, she's getting money from cryptocurrency. I looked for numbers from 2025 and 2026 for her, Israel related money. So during that time frame, she got $1.2 million from pro-Israel groups and over $371,000 from AIPAC. So she was also given an opportunity. So this gets to how she's actually voting on certain things. Thomas Massey introduced an amendment to the budget that the Republicans are pushing in the House, and he wanted to strip out $3.3 billion in money going to Israel because he didn't want to fund their genocide anymore. But Angie Craig didn't vote for that. She voted to basically keep that money in the budget, or at least she didn't vote to add that amendment into the budget in the House. 103 Democrats did, but not Angie Craig. And, that's just the money from the donors that disclose, that have to disclose who they are. There's plenty of money out there coming from groups that don't have to disclose who they are. And, needless to say, the base of the Democratic Party doesn't seem to support cryptocurrency, or they don't support giving money to Israel to bomb Gaza, Lebanon, or Iran. So at least from that standpoint, it doesn't look like Angie Craig is, doing herself much of a favor with the Democratic base, at least. And another big issue out there is healthcare. This is something the Democrats, talk about all the time in their campaigns. Flanagan has come out and supported Medicare for all, while Angie Craig has not. So again, the base, if you look at polling, the base of the Democratic Party supports Medicare for all now. They didn't do it, they didn't do it years ago. It's taken a while. But recent polling shows that they side with it now. So, that's an issue that separates the two of them. But perhaps the biggest one is immigration, of course. And, this is where Flanagan is seeming to get a lot more support than Craig is on that particular issue. And one reason why is Andrew Craig voted for the Lake and Riley Act, which was the first bill that, Trump signed when he took over in his second term. And it mandates the detention of undocumented immigrants who are accused of certain crimes, and the immigrants don't get any due process, and that law stripped courts of jurisdiction to review these cases. And Craig also voted for a House resolution that included language praising ICE agents on June 9th of 2025. So again, that was during the first year of Trump 2.0. So not surprisingly, Flanagan has been going after Craig on those particular votes. Craig has said she, quote, regrets, close quote, her vote on her Lake and Riley Act. She said that earlier this year. But that was well into the campaign. And Flanagan has come out and said, she supports abolishing ICE, while Craig has not. So this is another one of these issues where you as a primary voter, there's a pretty clear choice depending on who you support there. They got different positions on that particular topic when it comes to immigration. But we already know that Craig isn't really trying to get progressives or even the most politically active Democrats, because she, as we all know, she didn't go to the DFL convention, and Flanagan got the endorsement. And Craig's like, well, I'm just going to go on to the primary, because she, knew she wasn't going to get the endorsement. So, this is where we are with the upcoming primary. Now, I went and I kind of was looking around for, is there some like polling going on? Not a whole lot from what I could tell, but there was a public policy polling survey of Minnesota primary voters that came out at the end of June. So, it's within a month. They surveyed 604 Democrats who are, said they were going to vote in the primary. And the results were that they supported Flanagan 43%, and Craig was 36%. So if you total that up, that's 79%. So there's still, 21% undecided, I guess, at this point. So, so both of the candidates, they're going after those, the 21% that aren't really sure which one they're going to do, who they're going to vote for yet. So, they also looked at the favorability rating. So Flanagan, her number there was 52% favorability, while Craig's was 47%. So, on that one, it was pretty close, but Flanagan still had a 5% edge. On the unfavorability ratings, Craig had 28% unfavorability, while Flanagan had 14% unfavorability. So that difference is a little bit more than the favorability rating. So this is what the primary is going to resolve, right? Is like all Democrats, you need to get out there and either vote early or vote on August 11th. So once we get the results, so I had a nice conversation with one of my friends the other day about, what's going to happen if your, candidate didn't win. So, for example, if you were, a Flanagan fan, but she lost to Craig, or if you're a Craig fan and she lost to Flanagan, what's going to happen after the primaries? What are people going to do who, their candidate did not win? So, obviously the Democrats need to get behind whoever the winner is, because what's the alternative, right? A Democrat. Democrats, you got to get out there. Like, you can't just say, well, my candidate didn't win, so I'm not going to vote. Because if you do that, you're just giving the Republicans, right, and basically another vote. If you just decide, no, I'm not going to vote. I mean, this kind of is what happened to Harris in the 2024 election. A lot of people didn't like how, what her policy was on Palestine. And so, oh, well, I'm just not going to vote for her. So, we saw what happened there. Now, that's not the only reason why Harris lost, but, that was a big reason as, exit polling showed and that kind of thing. So please, Democrats, don't do the, well, my candidate lost, so I'm not going to vote for the winner. Things like, if you do stuff like that, that's going to give Michelle Tafoya the victory. We don't want that. Because if you, don't vote, if you don't vote for whoever the Democrat is, that means is basically Tafoya is going to get another vote here. So please stop with the purity tests. All right, get behind whoever wins. Because, in the end, democracy really is on the line. And that's basically what we're voting for here, right? In the end, is the Democrats want democracy to continue while the Republicans don't. They want authoritarianism. They want fascism. So, in the end, when I was talking with, my friend, we both agreed, well, she favored Craig and I favored Flanagan, as I've said before on this show. So, but we agreed to disagree. But in the end, at least we said, you know what? Whoever wins, we're still going to vote for him, whoever it is. So, we agreed to disagree, but we both realized, like, look, whoever wins, you got to vote for him in the general election, because we do not want Michelle Tafoya as senator from the state of Minnesota. All right, we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, I'm going to talk a little psychology. So we'll get into that when we come back from the break here on the Politics Matter Show. All right, welcome to the Politics Matter Show. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So before the break, I said we're going to talk about some psychology. Well, I don't claim to know a lot about psychology. I'm not a psychology expert. I didn't even take a psychology class in college. But as someone who teaches political science and someone who teaches economics, there's definitely psychology involved in both of those. So I've been, reading about that. I've learned a lot about that over the years. But so even though psychology isn't really part of the, title of the show, which is Civics, Politics, and Law, there's certainly a lot of psychology going on in politics and economics and really the law as well. So it kind of fits into all of those three things. But here is the question that I'm going to be like throwing out there for this segment, and hopefully it'll get you thinking a little bit about, how you would answer this and how this relates to politics and how in particular the Democratic Party should, deal with voters who vote for Republicans. So here's basically the question that led me to kind of do this segment is, why does MAGA, and you can throw in Republicans too, why do they blame Democrats for Trump's and the Republican Party's failure, in their ability to govern the second term? Or, well, you can even go back to Trump's first term, but we're going to talk about the second term here. So, I've heard and read this more and more as Trump 2.0 is failing so badly. And it's affecting MAGA as well as, some of the other Republicans and, even the rest of us. So, what's going on here? Because, you've probably seen some segments of some MAGA people saying, I didn't vote for this. I don't know why Trump was doing this and that kind of thing. So what's going on here? Why do people, particularly MAGA and Republicans, blame the Democrats for, basically Trump's and the Republican Party's their own failures? So again, I don't make any claim of being an expert with psychology or anything. But hopefully, it'll get you thinking a little bit about this as we move forward. So, part of psychology is dealing with the brain, right? And how we learn things and how we process things and all those sorts of things. Well, this relates to why does MAGA blame other people for their own problems that occur? Well, the most common reason is because MAGA can't blame themselves for their problems. So they blame you and me and other Democrats for their problems. So, for example, when gas prices went up, right, during Trump's first term so far, and it's going to go up more, as long as this war continues. Well, they still blame Biden for that. And if you listen to Hegseth's hearing in front of Congress the other day, I mean, he brought up Biden so many times. I mean, they're still out there blaming Biden for all of their problems that they are causing themselves. So another one blaming Biden was inflation, right? When Trump took over, Biden gave him an economy where the inflation rate was 2.9%. It had been up to 9 something during COVID, and Biden got it down to 2.9%. Well, it keeps going up. But who do they blame? Well, they blame Biden for some reason. Right? They got to blame somebody else. They can't blame themselves. So when tariffs, Trump's tariffs are hurting small businesses, causing some of them to close, causing, prices to go up because those costs are passed along to us customers. They blamed, again, Biden. They blame the Democrats. They blame the media. I mean, whoever they can think of, they blamed for that. And, when their retirement accounts go down because the stock market is, on a roller coaster, they blame the deep state for that, right? Even though the deep state is Trump and they're Republicans right now. So, I've talked about this before. When their grandma gets kicked off of Medicaid starting next year, when those cuts to Medicaid kick in, and grandma is getting kicked out of the nursing home because Medicaid ain't going to pay for it, MAGA is going to blame all the, waste, fraud, and abuse by the blue states rather than blaming the big, horrible bill, which is causing this, which the Republicans passed. When Republicans lost their ACA subsidies at the end of 2025. And if you're on, Minsure, for example, in Minnesota, you lost your subsidies. Well, they blamed Obama for that, not the Republicans who passed the big, horrible bill, which included cutting those subsidies. So I think you're getting the picture a little bit here, right? It's like, most normal people can admit when they're wrong about something. Because, we know nobody's perfect. We're certainly not perfect. Humans aren't perfect. We all make mistakes. Right? And, most of us, at least, can admit that, yeah, we made a mistake. And change our mind and move on. Right? Like, if you vote for a politician that, you like, but then ultimately they turned into a John Fetterman, for example, who's probably going to turn, to the Republican Party here soon. You can admit, you made a mistake on that one. Now, you're not happy about it, of course, but you can admit, I made a mistake on that one, and, you move on from it. But not Republicans and not MAGA. Why? Well, so why is that? Because voting for Trump wasn't just a decision that they made, about a politician. It became who they are, right? It became part of their identity. everything that they told their family and they told their friends that they stood for, everyone that they argued with, everybody that doesn't talk to them anymore, right? This is now their identity. They can't admit that they made a mistake. Since it isn't just, it isn't just one decision that was wrong, it was many that became part of their identity. So if they had to admit that one thing, they would have to admit that all kinds of things, that they made all kinds of mistakes or bad decisions. And they can't admit that they were wrong about themselves. Their brain won't allow it because they can't admit that, the truth that they were wrong. So this is why it's always somebody else's fault, not their own fault. Basically, it's their defense mechanisms kicking in, right? That's what your brain does. When you're anxious or, people are, criticizing you or something like that, right? Your defense mechanisms kick in your brain. And for many of these MAGA people and for many Republicans, it overrides their critical thinking skills, this defensive mechanism in their brain. So it overrides their critical thinking skills. So, they ultimately, they don't consider that, maybe I was just wrong here. So instead of looking inward at themselves and the decision that they made and some of the reasons why they made that decision, they don't do that. They look outward for someone else to blame. So for MAGA and for the Republicans, that target is Democrats. Or specifically, like Biden or Harris. Right. Or if you want to, certain groups like, well, that's the LGBTQ, that group's fault. Or it's, trans people's fault, right? It's the undocumented, immigrants' fault. It's always somebody else's fault. They're always blaming somebody else because they can't admit that they were wrong themselves. So, they're not angry at you because, you're wrong. Rather, they're angry at you for pointing out how Trump and the Republicans are causing damage to them. So that's how they react to you. They just can't admit that, yeah, even though there's damage being caused to them. I've talked on this show before about particularly rural voters. Why do rural voters keep voting for Republicans when it's against your own interests? What have the Republicans done for you economically, for example? Now, there might be some social reasons why you support the Republican Party, but economic ones, really? What are they doing that's supporting you? So they just have to, when people point out to them, no, you're really causing damage to themselves. They just, that's when they get mad at you. So the damage, basically proves that they did this with their votes. They're basically mad because, the damage is not only occurring to themselves, but, other people who have their same sort of identity, right? So they just, they won't admit it's their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. They won't take accountability for their decisions. And as a result of this, we have fascists in charge of our government at the federal level, at least now, in many other states across the country. So, the current people in charge of the federal government, they don't give a crap about the people who voted for them. They don't give a crap about the Republicans who voted for them or the MAGA people that voted for them. They just want to enrich themselves at our expense and the expense of the MAGA people in particular who keep gladly giving them money. And here we are, we got to pay for their greed and suffering through the results of the policies that they are enacting. But it's never the Republicans or the MAGA people's fault that this is occurring because of their votes. Plus, when you add in all the false propaganda spread by Fox Lies and the right-wing media, 24/7, day after day after day after day, people start believing the lies. And when they start doing that, it's tougher for them to admit that they were wrong. Even when they're being, the ones being victimized. So, if you watch Fox Lies and, I do just, usually I would not, but I do for my teaching job. It's always the immigrants' fault. Now the latest one is, it's the socialists and the communists. Right? That's their latest thing is, all Democrats are commies. You don't want to have commies in office, right? Going back to that, the old claims made during the Cold War, and I just don't think that's going to work on today's voters. But, they're trying. And some people, of course, will believe it because that's what they hear. They hear it over and over and over and over. And, Trump and the Republicans know that, know this. Propaganda is, works on some people, so they keep exploiting it. And when you listen to this stuff, I find myself saying, okay, you make these claims. Where's your evidence? And of course, they never give any because there isn't any for all these claims. It's just all their opinions. And or it's just outright lies. Again, that's why I call it Fox Lies, because listen to it one day. But Republicans just eat this up. And I think a lot of Republicans know that this isn't really the truth, but they don't care because the people, eating up all this stuff helps keep the Republicans in power. So I don't care. Even the ones that, know this is BS, they don't care. Right? Just like the MAGA people who, are hurt economically from a lot of these decisions. They keep giving money to Trump. Even though he doesn't do anything for them and even though he just grifts money off of them. And then when when some of them finally, realize, there's something's going on here. They love to say, well, I didn't vote for this. Well, actually, yeah, you did. I mean, I've talked before a number of times about how this was all laid out in Project 2025. And if you listen to, Trump's campaign, yeah, you voted for this stuff. I mean, it wasn't like he was hiding this. It wasn't like the Republicans were hiding this. I mean, it was out there, but you still voted for it. Or when, when a lot of this stuff was pointed out to them, they go, well, that's just fake news. Well, no, it's not. They just won't accept the reality here again, because then if they did that, they would have to admit that they were wrong. And they don't want to do that. Republicans love to come out. You hear them all the time talking about, we're the party of personal responsibility. Yeah, no, you're not. You're not taking responsibility for voting for Trump and voting for these Republicans who are, basically enacting authoritarian policies and fascist policies and wanting to get rid of democracy. So there's going to be some Republicans out there saying, well, come on, Bruce, you're overblowing what the Republicans want. No, I'm not. If you actually look and see what they're doing, no, I'm not. You just can't accept that. So much for being the party of personal responsibility. So Democrats, what can you take away from this? Well, this is where you got to stop trying to change their minds of the Republicans, because they're just not going to do it. Now, some of them ultimately may, if it affects their family enough, But they're not going to do it because, well, I believe that logic or that, letter, strongly worded letter the Democrats wrote. No, that's not going to change anybody's mind. So stop trying to do it. The only way they're going to change their mind is if, they do it on their own. You're not going to convince them to change their mind. So Democrats used to spend more time and money trying to get the people who did not vote. Right? The largest voting bloc in 2024 was the group that didn't vote. Spend the money on getting out your own base. Spend the money on getting out more more independents. And spend money on getting, the non-voters, the people that don't usually vote. Get them out there and vote. You got to give them a reason to vote for the Democrats, not just, well, we're against Trump. Trump is bad. Republicans are bad. That's not going to cut it either. You got to give them reasons to vote for the Democrats. And I think if you're able to do that, the midterm elections, again, I'm still hopeful that the Democrats are going to take the House and the Senate. So let's hope that's the case. But please, Democrats, don't spend all your time and your money trying to convince Republicans to vote for you, because they're not going to. Because they're not going to admit that they were wrong. All right, we're going to take our next break here. And when we come back, I'm going to talk some more about data centers here on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter show, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. All right, so for this last segment here, last week I talked about data centers a little bit. I'm going to do it again because I think this could be a good policy for the Democrats to run on, to get a hold of, to get people to associate, the Democrats are against data centers, because that, I think, is an issue there where they can get more voters. Because even Republicans are against data centers. Now, again, that doesn't mean they're going to vote for Democrats, but, they're against it, which can help, the end results when for example, your city council has to vote about data centers, or your county board has to vote about data centers, or your Minnesota legislature's got to, vote on data centers at some point. All right, so this segment I'm going to just talk about why I think data centers is a good thing for the Democrats to run on. So, I mentioned last week New York, right? They're the first state to do a 1-year moratorium on their hyperscale data centers. So this was done by executive order by the governor, Kathy Hochul. So one thing to watch for when you're talking about data centers is, are you talking about all data centers, or are you talking about just the hyperscale data centers? Because they're two separate things. Hyperscale are the big ones, right? The huge ones that are, going to be built out in, if you look at a lot of the proposals, they're out in more rural areas where there's a lot of land, and then they can, build out a lot more than they can in, the cities or urban areas. So, of course, Mango Mussolini got quite upset about this, when New York did this. So, he posted on Live Social that, New York should change its policy immediately, among other things. I mean, he went on and on and on about this. But basically, and this is what Republicans, this is what they will say is like, well, if we don't do it here, China's just going to do it. And, this is more about, we're going to have to be afraid of China, right? This is another way the Republicans try and get you scared, right? Try and get people scared so that they will vote for the Republicans who will somehow save us, which of course doesn't make sense. But data centers, right? This is rapidly becoming one of the big issues in the midterm elections. And this is why Democrats, are celebrating the fact that Trump and the Republicans are making themselves the data center champions. All right. And you can see a little bit about, of this in Minnesota so far. I'll get into that here in a minute. But poll after poll shows that Americans are turning against data centers. Like they don't want them in their town, they don't want them in their area, etc. Right? So in January, a Marquette Law School poll showed that people oppose data centers 62% to 37%. A Gallup poll in May found 71% of the people opposed to the construction of data centers in their area. A Reuters Ipsos poll in June, so fairly recent one, shows 64% think building data centers is a bad thing. So, when you see results like that, it's, here again, it's not just Democrats that are opposing it, it's also Republicans. So given how unpopular data centers are and how people use this issue, when you're arguing against big tech, right? People bring up data centers when you're arguing against, what greedy billionaires are trying to do, because many of these companies, right? It's the Metas of the world and the Amazons of the world who are trying to build these big data centers. Right. And then not to mention the threats against AI. So Democrats should jump on this issue because people don't want to support the tech industry. They don't want to support greedy billionaires. A lot of people don't support, being taken over by AI and then people losing their jobs as a result of that. So data centers are distinct from other capital investments because once it's built, basically it only requires a handful of people to keep it running. So sometimes you hear a union saying this, right? Oh, the jobs, I support it because of the jobs. Well, yeah, there's, depending on what state you're in again, there are union jobs building data centers in some places. But when the construction's all done, bye-bye union workers. Right? The companies they only need a handful of people to cover just these, the day-to-day operations at these data centers, or they just do it remotely. They don't even have people in the building, or very few. So this whole idea about, there's going to be all these jobs. No, not after construction, there isn't. So this, long-term job argument is just false. And I think more and more people are seeing this and understanding this. The downsides to data centers are numerous. They require massive amounts of power, like electricity and or coal, potentially straining the local power grid and spiking local energy prices. Of course, there's pollution, especially if they're using coal. They use a large amount of water to cool the equipment. They're very noisy. If you happen to live by one, and I've driven by some, I'm like, man, I'm glad I don't live by one, because they are loud. There's light pollution because oftentimes these lights are on 24/7. So if you happen to live, near one, that can mess up your sleep cycle. Unless you're able to, get rid of the light pollution somehow. Tax breaks. I mean, a lot of these companies get all kinds of tax breaks, but that you and I don't get. And the secrecy involved. I mean, this is the one I think that really pisses off people, including Republicans, where the local politicians sign these non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs as they're called, to not say anything about the project, either while they're being discussed or, they don't even make anything public. They just come out one day and vote for it. And oftentimes they can't say anything after they do this vote either. So they don't take any public comment. They don't do any environmental review or very little environmental review. And this is pissing off a lot of people, that the secrecy involved here. So at the national level, of course, Trump and the Republicans, they want Congress to pass a law to basically ban regulation of AI and ban regulation of data centers by the states and local governments. So again, this is an issue Democrats should be able to run on, and also in your own state, right? If you're a state legislature candidate, you can run on this too, where Republicans, they don't want any regulation of data centers. So this is one reason why state and local governments are moving, more. You're seeing more and more of them move towards a moratorium, or at least regulating data centers and AI. So when they do these moratoriums, basically what they're doing is they're trying to figure out a way to come up with some reasonable regulations, or potentially not approving the project at all. So as far as I could tell, New York's the only state that's done a moratorium thus far, but there's lots of cities and even some counties around the country that have done this. So in Minnesota, for example, Egan's done it, Inver Grove Heights has done it, Minneapolis has done it for the bigger hyper data centers. The city of Carver has, and even Wright County, I think, has done it. So some of these moratoriums are for a year, some of them are for 6 months. So, for example, in Minneapolis, rather, their moratorium is if it's over 350,000 square feet. So, for smaller ones, the moratorium doesn't affect that, but for the bigger ones, it does. So if you're not aware, in Minnesota, there's already 60 data centers, and there's a proposal for 20 of these new hyperscale data centers. In other words, the real big ones. So that's 20 just in Minnesota that are being proposed. So if 10 out of the 20 are approved, they would consume as much energy as the entire state of Minnesota does. So, where are we going to get that extra electricity? Right? The Meta-backed facility proposed in Farmington would double the city's water consumption. So, do they have that extra water around? So in Farmington, the city council has already approved that data center, but there was a lawsuit filed, so it's in court now. So the latest that I could find about that court hearing is that the city moved to dismiss the case, in other words, to let the data center go forth, but the judge in that case said, no, not going to do it. So that case is still ongoing, and the city officials can't comment on it because they signed an NDA. Big surprise, right? Similarly, some developers in Faribault recently lost in the Minnesota Court of Appeals because they did an inadequate environmental assessment worksheet. So there's similar cases involving Hermantown, Pine Island, and Monticello that are in court because of some of these environmental problems. So this is a winning issue, Democrats. So run on this. Right? All right. Have a good week. We will talk to you next week here on the Politics Matters show.